remember in the first section we talked about the different plans that went forward for Reconstruction, the ones that were proposed, and also we discussed a little bit about what Reconstruction was and why it was necessary in the South, and also some problems that were associated with it. In this section, we're going to talk about the Republican rule in the South, because you'll remember that Lincoln, after his assassination, was replaced by Johnson, who will not go down in history as one of our best presidents by any means. And he also went through the impeachment process, and we go through a period of time now where Congress is very powerful. The president is not as powerful. We're going to have a series of presidents who go through some corruption and just don't have that sweeping effect that Lincoln did. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and we'll get into that as we continue on. But for this section, we're going to talk about what the South was like when the Republicans were actually in charge of this area. Now, it's one of those areas where, you know, the South, you've got to remember the South, this is a way of life for them, slavery, and it's a fear of theirs to have outsiders come in and tell them what to do, and that's really what the Republicans were doing in this situation. And it did not go over well in the South, and we're going to discuss kind of why and what some of the effects were of that. So the Republicans are in charge of the South, and there's two groups that the Southerners are very afraid of, besides the government. They're afraid of carpetbaggers and scalawags, afraid/angry at. And I'll explain what both are. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved into the South. Now, there are a lot of reasons that they might move into the South, whether it was to look for work. You know, there's obviously a lot of Reconstruction, which is why it's called Reconstruction, to be done. A lot of rebuilding of railroads, a lot of buildings and infrastructure that needs to be fixed. There are also groups that went down to help improve the situation for the former slaves. And then also, as there always seems to be when there's a natural disaster or a national issue in the United States, there are groups that go in and they kind of scam people. And there are some Northerners that definitely probably went down there and scammed, whether former slaves or whites who had lost land and things like that. The other group is the scalawags. They were Southerners who worked with Northerners. And both were looked at as bad people. These people, though, were looked at as traitors. These people were looked at as those who are against the South, against the Southern way of life. And, you know, in a lot of situations, they were just people who wanted to help rebuild. They were past the Civil War. They wanted to get the South going again and get the country going again as well. So you have those two groups in the South. Also, you start to see some African Americans in politics, and it's a tough thing. A lot align with the Republican Party, and the Republicans do give them some opportunities to get into politics. You do have some congressional appointments, no huge gains. Some get into Congress, some get into state legislatures. It's around this time that you do see your first black governor, and that's an issue because you won't see another one, I think, until the late 1900s. So this is obviously a big deal as well, but getting African Americans into politics is huge. It's huge for this time. A lot of these people who were former slaves eventually get into these high positions. And it's difficult for the South to accept that. And a lot of that is driven off fear. Yes, there's some hatred. Yes, there's some this is our way of life talk. But a lot of it is fear as well, because these are people who have been oppressed for a very long time. And who's to say that they're not going to rise up against the South? And so Southerners, a lot of what happens over the next, well, you know what, we're going to say even into the 1960s and 70s, is motivated by fear more than hatred, I believe. This fear of what's going to happen if we do give rights, what's going to happen if we do give freedoms. Some of the reform that does take place in the South as well, they tried to repeal the black codes. Now, it's this great idea that we're going to go in and we're going to completely repeal them, but just going in and saying we're repealing black codes doesn't really make do. You can put troops in the South, which there are, you can put people in the South, but the South is a large area, and you can't control what everybody's doing. So although they make an attempt to repeal the black codes are going to come back into play multiple times in different forms. Also, they improve infrastructure, you know, again, roads, railroads, things of that nature, because it's in the benefit of the North to get the South going again as well. The South is great farmland. There's a lot of agriculture that goes down, a lot of trade that comes out of the South. So it's important to get the South on its feet again as well. Problem is there is corruption. There's corruption in the South, and that's something you can't always avoid. That there is corruption. There's money going through politics, and it was also common in the North. But it gave Democrats kind of a driving force in the South to say, look at all the corruption that's going through the Republicans. And that's going to eventually leave it open for Democrats to take positions in the South again, away from the Republicans. They really play off this Republican corruption in the South. Now, there are some things. African American communities start up, and not just communities of African Americans, but they start to get a sense of community. Instead of being tied to someone's land, all of a sudden they are on their own, and this can be a scary thing. And so there are two different institutions that really allow for African Americans to come together, and they become very vital and very important to the history of African Americans. The first is churches. Churches in history allow for the promotion of values, the certain values of a society. But it also gave them a chance to organize. It gave them a chance to organize in groups and feel that sense of community, to make connections. So they knew people, protection, and power in numbers. One of the things that the First Amendment says here in the United States is that right to assembly, and this is a perfect example of that right to assembly, where the people are assembling and coming up with ways to reform and coming up with ways to change and voicing their grievances in a society in the South that didn't always listen to that or didn't always care about that. So churches become very important to this group as well as schools. A comprehensive school system is in place by the 1870s, and that allows for a lot of African American students to go and get an education. A lot of times an education their parents don't have, reading and writing. I was asked a question not long ago by somebody as I was talking about this that asked why African Americans didn't just leave in droves after they were freed. In a lot of cases it came down to the means. They didn't have the means. A lot of them were tied to land as sharecroppers. A lot of them were tied to land as tenant farmers. They weren't able to necessarily leave. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the resources. And also they couldn't read. They couldn't write. So marketability in the workforce isn't always great. It's their children that you'll really see the mass exodus out of the South and into different parts of the United States. And also some new opportunities will open up. We'll get into that in the next chapter as far as the new opportunities. 40% of all African American children are attending school during this time, and that's a big number. I mean, that's a big number for a group that it was very low before that. There are obviously gains being made. Now, the sad part about this is these are all segregated schools, and that obviously will last for quite a long time, and we'll get to why that eventually happens. Now, the Southerners obviously resist this. The Southerners aren't just open to these groups coming in and these groups changing them. And so as a result, we have some different groups that form. We have the Ku Klux Klan that gets formed in the late 1800s, and their main purpose was to terrorize blacks and whites who supported African Americans. Not just blacks. I think that's a misconception sometimes with the Ku Klux Klan, that they're just only against African Americans. They were against a lot of different groups, anybody who supported these changes in the South. And so not everybody was safe. They also, terrorized different things in, as far as voting, as far as things like that, to suppress the blacks, to keep them down. Now, the response to the Ku Klux Klan is interesting. President Grant outlawed the group. He made them, basically it would be the equivalent of today naming a group a hate group. And then he said it was a federal crime to stop voting and sent troops to the South to patrol voting. And a lot of people were arrested during this time. And I talked about how when troops are sent to any place in the United States and they're U.S. troops, that means that there's obviously a sign of something wrong going on. And it's always kind of a sad state of affairs if you have to send in your own troops to protect a people and the people who have citizenship. And so troops patrol the voting, and they do make arrests, but most are not convicted. And that's because you have Southerners who get arrested, and then they go in front of Southern courts who have Southern judges, Southern juries, and a lot of them do not face any jail time, do not face any major fines. So that's kind of one of those things that's going to happen throughout history as well. So basically the key points from this section that you need to know is that a lot of reforms were started in the South. We already know that the Freedmen's Bureau is down there trying to do things. We know that education has improved in the South for blacks. We know that they're getting more opportunities in Congress. Nothing sweeping, nothing that's going to be so overwhelming that it's going to make everybody equal. But it is an improvement. And also a lot of groups were formed that do not support the change in the South, that do not support the freedom of the slaves or the rights that former slaves should have. In the next section, we're going to get into the collapse of Reconstruction that will eventually come down the line, and maybe discuss some of the lasting effects that came from that.